The road didn't end so much as it surrendered to the mountain. They called it Blackwood Ridge, a jagged spine of rock and ancient timber buried deep in the unforgiving heart of the Pacific Northwest. I was 28, drowning in 40 grand of gambling debt and out of options. When I found the dark web listing, Blackwood Manor, winter caretaker, extreme isolation, $10,000 a month, I didn't hesitate. 6 months of chopping wood and hiding from debt collectors sounded like a vacation. I was a colossal idiot. My beat-up Silverado finally broke through the claustrophobic tree line into a massive clearing. Blackwood Manor sat dead center, 50 yards from the woods on all sides. It was a blackened 3-story Victorian fortress perched on the edge of a sheer gorge. Standing on the porch, holding a lever-action 12-gauge shotgun casually against his hip, was the man I was supposed to replace. I threw the truck in park and stepped out into the freezing rain. Elias? He didn't lower the gun. He looked like a prisoner of war, gaunt, terrified, his eyes like 2 burnt holes in his skull. His left hand was wrapped in a dirty, blood-soaked bandage. "Move fast," Elias rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "Do not look at the trees." The naked terror in his voice wasn't an act. I grabbed my duffel bag and jogged up the steps. He shoved me inside, slammed the heavy oak door, and immediately dropped a massive forged iron bar across the center, bolting it into the frame. "Hey man, take it easy," I said, dropping my bag. "The agency sent me to keep the pipes from freezing. You don't need the artillery." Elias sneered, racking the shotgun with a sharp clack. "The agency lawyers get off on sending kids to the slaughterhouse. You're not a janitor, Sam. You're bait. You're the blood in the water that keeps them focused on this house." He walked to a heavy oak table in the center of the dim, high-ceilinged room. On it sat a satellite phone, a black leather ledger, and a pristine white 6-sided die. He slammed his uninjured hand on the ledger. "Read the protocol," Elias whispered, his eyes darting to the steel-meshed windows. "Burn it into your brain. If you screw up even one of these, dying is your best-case scenario." I looked down at the paper. The 5 rules were written in thick, aggressive black ink. Absolute illumination. At exactly 20 minutes before sunset, every light on the property must be engaged. They do not turn off until 20 minutes after sunrise. Never allow a room to go pitch black. The night lockdown. Between dusk and dawn, the house is a sealed tomb. Doors do not open. Whatever you hear outside, no matter who it pretends to be or how much it screams, do not interact. They are flawless mimics. The variable of chance. Every morning at 8 a.m., roll the white die. If it lands on a 6, dial the emergency contact on the sat phone. Say your name, say the number, and hang up. Do not ask for help. The deaf ear. After sunset, if you hear knocking on the doors, the roof, or the glass, ignore it entirely. Acknowledging the knock invites the breach. The 3rd floor quarantine. The southeast bedroom on the 3rd floor is padlocked. Never go near the door. If the temperature plummets and you hear a baby crying from up there, turn on the basement furnace and pray it goes to sleep. I looked up, expecting a punchline. "All right, Elias, good Halloween prank." Elias grabbed the collar of my jacket, pulling me down to his level. The guy before me thought it was a joke, too. He heard a woman crying outside, sounded just like his dead sister. He undid one deadbolt just to look. Elias swallowed hard. I found pieces of him spread over 2 miles of forest. They unraveled him. He shoved me back, just as the sky above the tree line began to bruise into a heavy purple. Sunset. Lock it down. Elias sprinted down the hall, throwing heavy breaker switches. Instantly, the manor ignited. Blinding halogen lights flared inside, and massive stadium floodlights kicked on outside, pushing a harsh artificial daylight 50 yards out into the clearing. He sat in the leather armchair facing the front door, the shotgun across his lap. I sat on the sofa opposite him. At exactly 11:14 p.m., the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in a single second. I saw my breath plume in the air. From outside, Beyond the thick oaken iron came the distinct, horrific sound of a car crash. The screeching of tires, the violent crunch of metal, the shattering of glass. Then came the screaming. "Oh God, help! My legs are crushed!" I bolted upright. "Elias, someone drove off the ridge!" "Protocol 2, Sam," Elias said, his voice dead calm despite the terror freezing his face. "There is no road out there. Sit down." "Help me! Sam, please!" I froze. The voice had screamed my name. "Sam, it's me, it's Dave. Man, help me, the car's on fire." The air left my lungs. It was my younger brother, Dave, the one who lived in Chicago, 2,000 miles away. "They read you," Elias whispered. "They plucked the guilt right out of your head. They wear it." The horrific stench of roasting meat and burning hair suddenly seeped through the cracks in the doorframe. I dry heaved, falling to my knees. "Let me in, Sam," the voice outside sobbed, but the tone began to warp, dropping into a guttural, inhuman resonance. "Let me in so I can wear your skin." Bang! Something incredibly heavy slammed against the front door. The forged iron bar bent a fraction of an inch. Then the knocking started. Not on the door, but on every single window of the house simultaneously. A rapid, frantic tapping from dozens of entities surrounding the manor. I pulled my knees to my chest and covered my ears, but the sound penetrated my skull. The tapping, the burning smell, the voice of my brother shifting into a demonic chorus of laughter. "Ignore it," Elias chanted, his finger trembling on the trigger. "It's not real. It's not real." The psychological siege lasted for hours. I sat paralyzed in primal terror, finally understanding that a week of this would shatter anyone's sanity. Just before dawn, the assault stopped completely. The heavy weight lifted from the room, and the temperature stabilized. When the harsh glare of the floodlights mixed with the gray morning, Elias slowly stood up. He hauled the heavy iron bar away and opened the door. There was no charred car. The gravel was pristine. The only evidence was a cluster of deep, jagged gouge marks scraped into the solid oak, 4 inches deep. Elias walked back to the table, his hands steady. The frantic energy burned out. He picked up the white die and dropped it onto the ledger. It bounced twice and settled. 6 dots. A grim, terrifying smile crept across Elias's face. "I survived my shift," he whispered. He picked up the sat phone, dialed, and said, "Elias Thorne, Protocol 3, I rolled 6. He hung up, grabbed his duffel bag, and walked toward the door. "They've got your scent now, Sam," he said, stepping out into the morning mist. "Don't look out the windows, and whatever you do, don't lose the die." He drove away down the muddy trail, leaving me alone in the deafening silence of Blackwood Manor. The 6 dots stared up at me from the table. My 6 months in hell had just begun. The sound of Elias's Bronco faded long before the vehicle actually disappeared, swallowed by the dense, suffocating acoustics of the Pacific Northwest timber. When the final rumble of the engine died, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was almost violent. It had a physical weight. I stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor, the morning mist dampening my clothes, and stared at the jagged gouge marks in the solid oak door, 4 inches deep. The wood was splintered and raw. I reached out and traced the grooves with a trembling finger. No bear made those marks. No human could have bent that forged iron bar. I was alone. I was 50 miles from the nearest paved road, without cell service, without a vehicle, trapped in a gilded cage with a ledger full of insane rules and a white die sitting on the dining table showing a 6. "They've got your scent now, Sam," Elias's words echoed in my head. Panic, raw and metallic, flared in the back of my throat. My first instinct was to run, to pack my duffel bag, start walking down the logging trail, and take my chances with the freezing rain. But my rational mind, the cynical, surviving part of me, kicked in. It would take 2 days to hike out of the Blackwood Ridge. I wouldn't survive one night in those trees. The house was a nightmare, but out there was a slaughterhouse. I walked back inside, shut the door, and slid the heavy iron door back into place, even though it was barely 9 a.m. The day was supposed to be my sanctuary, but Blackwood Manor in the daylight was just a different kind of terrifying. It was too big, too empty. I spent the next few hours aggressively trying to normalize my environment. I needed a routine. I needed to map my cage. I checked the pantry. Elias wasn't kidding about the supplies. Aisles of canned soup, vacuum-sealed military rations, 50-pound bags of rice and flour. There was enough food here to wait out a nuclear winter. Then I explored the house. The ground floor was all heavy timber, leather, and cast iron. The second floor held a dozen dusty, mothball-scented bedrooms covered in faded floral wallpaper that looked like it belonged in a Victorian sanitarium. But it was the third floor that made my chest tighten. I walked up the narrow, creaking servants' stairs. The air grew noticeably colder with every step, shedding the ambient heat of the great room. At the end of a long, narrow hallway lined with peeling paint, I found the southeast bedroom, Rule 5, the third-floor quarantine. The door was made of heavy, dark mahogany, but it had been aggressively modified. 3 heavy-duty steel hasps were bolted into the frame, secured with thick, rusted master locks. Crisscrossing the entire door were heavy iron chains. But the most unsettling detail wasn't the hardware. It was the door frame itself. The wood around the edges of the door was heavily scratched and splintered. But the scratch marks weren't on the outside. They were on the inside. Something had been trying to claw its way out. I backed away slowly, the hairs on my arms standing at attention. I didn't test the doorknob. I didn't linger. I turned and practically ran back down the stairs to the ground floor. I spent the afternoon out in the generator shed. The deafening roar of the twin caterpillars was the only thing keeping the crushing silence at bay. I checked the day tank. I checked the oil. I memorized the sequence for the manual battery override Elias had shown me. If the main diesel generator stutters, you have 90 seconds to manually engage the battery bank before the darkness fills the house. Never, under any circumstances, allow a room to go pitch black. I practiced running from the armchair in the great room to the massive steel breaker panel in the main hallway. 8 seconds. I could make it in 8 seconds if I didn't trip over the Persian rug. By 4 p.m., the sky began its rapid decay into twilight. The anxiety building in my gut was acidic. The ritual of illumination began. 20 minutes before sunset, I started flipping switches. Floor lamps, chandeliers, track lighting, the massive exterior halogens. The house lit up like a beacon, pushing the encroaching shadows back into the tree line. I checked the wooden window shutters. I checked the iron bar on the front door. I made a pot of black coffee, poured it into a thermos, and sat in the heavy leather armchair facing the entryway. The shotgun Elias had left behind rested across my lap. It was loaded with double-aught buckshot. I didn't know if it would do any good, but the heavy steel felt grounding. The sun vanished behind the ridge. The transition was absolute. 1 minute it was dusk, the next it was a black void pressing against the glass. I waited. 10 p.m. passed. Midnight. 2 a.m. Nothing happened. No car crashes, no screaming brother, no frantic knocking on the steel mesh. There was only the steady, comforting thrum of the diesel generator outside. My adrenaline spiked and crashed repeatedly, leaving me exhausted, jittery, and paranoid. Every pop of a settling floorboard made me aim the shotgun. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. By 3:15 a.m., my eyelids were heavy. The warmth of the fire was sedating. My chin dropped to my chest. Just for a second, just a quick blink. Chug, chug, cough. The sound from outside was subtle, but to my hypervigilant brain, it sounded like a bomb going off. The low, steady hum of the generator had skipped a beat. My eyes snapped open. The lights in the great room flickered, a sickly brown dimming of the bulbs. Chug, wheeze, silence. With a heavy, definitive thunk, the main power grid died. The house plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. It was a darkness so complete, So sudden, it felt like a physical blow to the head. I couldn't see the gun in my lap. I couldn't see my own hand inches from my face. The silence that rushed in to replace the generator's roar was deafening. "You have 90 seconds. God damn it, I screamed, the sound of my own voice shocking me. I threw the shotgun onto the sofa and bolted upright. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. 8 seconds to the panel. I sprinted blindly across the great room. My foot caught the edge of the heavy oak coffee table. Pain exploded up my shin, but I didn't stop. I hit the hardwood floor of the hallway, my hands outstretched, feeling for the wall. The air in the house was already changing. The ambient heat was evaporating, replaced by a damp, freezing chill that smelled faintly of rotting earth. I felt the cold metal of the breaker panel. I yanked the heavy door open. I fumbled in the blackness, my fingers desperately searching for the large industrial lever on the far right. 40 seconds. I found the handle. I gripped it with both hands and pulled down with all my weight. Sparks showered from the contact point with a loud crack. Instantly, the house exploded back into blinding yellow light. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, sweat stinging my eyes. I looked at my watch. I had done it in 35 seconds. I was safe. I hadn't broken the rule. But the relief didn't last. I was leaning against the wall in the hallway, breathing hard, when I noticed the temperature. The lights were on, but the house was freezing. My breath plumed in the air in thick white clouds. The chill was seeping through my flannel shirt, sinking deep into my bones. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, a thin, reedy sound drifting down from the ceiling above me. Whoa! Whoa! I froze, the blood turning to ice water in my veins. It was a baby crying. It sounded small, wet, and miserable, and it was coming directly from the 3rd floor, from the locked nursery. Rule 5. If the temperature plummets and you hear a baby crying from up there, turn on the basement furnace and pray it goes back to sleep. No, I whispered to the empty hallway. No way. The crying grew louder. It wasn't a normal cry. There was a sickening, gurgling undertone to it, like a child trying to scream with lungs full of muddy water. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, scraping against my eardrums. It felt less like an auditory noise and more like a psychic projection boring directly into my brain. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Frost began to spiderweb across the corners of the hallway mirrors. I had to go to the basement. The basement door was at the end of the hall, right next to the kitchen. I grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight from the emergency hook on the wall, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I walked toward the door. The crying from upstairs shifted. It stopped being a miserable wail and turned into a frantic, aggressive shriek. Whatever was in that room was angry, and it sounded like it was throwing its weight against the chained door. Thump! 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 I reached the basement door, turned the knob, and pulled it open. A wave of air hit me, smelling of ancient coal dust, mildew, and wet stone. The staircase was steep, made of rotting wood, plunging down into a cavernous, unfinished subterranean level. The basement wasn't wired into the main lighting grid. Only 3 pathetic naked bulbs hung from the rafters on pole chains. I clicked on the Maglite. The beam cut through the thick, dusty darkness. Just the furnace, I muttered to myself, an obsessive mantra. Just the furnace. Don't look around. I descended the stairs, the wood groaning loudly under my boots. The shrieking from the 3rd floor was somewhat muffled down here, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of being underground. The basement was a labyrinth of stacked wooden crates, broken antique furniture, and rusted farm equipment, spanning the entire footprint of the massive house. I swept the beam of the flashlight around until I saw it in the far corner, a monstrous cast-iron oil furnace that looked like a Victorian locomotive engine. I navigated the maze of junk, keeping my eyes locked on the furnace. The concrete floor was slick with condensation. I reached the massive iron machine. Elias had showed me the prime sequence briefly. I grabbed the heavy red valve and cranked it open. I hit the electronic ignition switch. Nothing happened. The cold down here was absolute. I could barely feel my fingers. I hit the switch again. Click. Nothing. From the dark corner of the basement, beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, came a sound. Scrape. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the wet concrete. My heart stopped. I spun around, sweeping the heavy maglite beam into the darkness. The light caught stacks of rotting chairs, a rusted wheelbarrow, shadows stretching long and distorted against the stone foundation. Nothing else. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. It was a stupid American horror movie question, but the primal fear demanded I speak. Silence. And then, from the ceiling directly above my head, the floorboards of the great room, came a soft rhythmic tapping. Tap. 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 They were inside. Not the basement. Not the third floor. They had bypassed the locks. They were walking around in the illuminated great room right above me. Panic seized me entirely. I slammed my fist onto the electronic ignition of the furnace, holding the button down, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in a decade. Whoosh! With a deep, resonant roar, the massive iron furnace ignited. The heavy metal instantly began to radiate an intense, localized heat. The red glow of the pilot fire cast dancing shadows across the basement walls. I didn't wait to see if the heat would work. I sprinted back through the maze of junk, taking the rotting wooden stairs 3 at a time. I burst through the basement door into the hallway and slammed it shut, leaning my entire body weight against it. I stood there, panting, the sweat freezing on my skin. I listened. The house was silent. The frantic shrieking from the 3rd floor had ceased entirely. The soft tapping from the great room was gone. Slowly, the ambient temperature in the hallway began to rise, the frost on the mirrors melting into thin streaks of water. I walked slowly back into the great room, the maglite raised like a club. The halogens were still blazing. The room was perfectly empty. The heavy iron bar was still secure across the front door. The steel shutters were untouched. Nothing had breached the perimeter. The house was secure. I collapsed back into the leather armchair, my muscles turning to liquid. I looked at the coffee table, at the heavy black ledger, and the white die sitting beside it. The entities in the woods weren't the only things I had to worry about. The house itself was infected. It was a living, breathing organism, and it was actively trying to kill me from the inside out. I picked up the shotgun, rested it on my lap, and stared at the front door. It was 4:10 a.m. I had 3 more hours until sunrise, and 179 more nights left on my contract. The morning sun didn't bring warmth. It only brought clarity to the wreckage of my nerves. When the halogen lights finally hummed into silence 20 minutes after sunrise, the gray light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters felt like a cold shroud. I didn't move from the armchair for a long time. My hand was still cramped around the grip of the shotgun, and my eyes felt like they had been scrubbed with glass. The memory of that wet, gurgling cry from the nursery and the phantom tapping in the great room felt like a fever dream. But the lingering smell of ozone from the generator's failure was a brutal reminder of how close I'd come to the dark. I stood up, my joints screaming, and walked to the dining table. Rule 3, the daily roll. It was 7:58 a.m. I looked at the white die. It was perfectly square, perfectly clean, and felt heavier than any piece of plastic had a right to be. It sat on the black leather ledger like a silent judge. I picked it up. My palm was sweaty. I shook the die in my closed fist, hearing the faint thump of it against my skin. I thought about Elias. I thought about the way he smiled when he rolled a 6, a smile of a man who was finally being allowed to leave a burning building. I dropped the die onto the table. It didn't bounce. It hit the wood with a heavy thud, as if it were made of lead, and rolled once. 2. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A 2 meant no phone call. A 2 meant I didn't have to explain anything to the cool, dead voices at the agency. I grabbed the pen and recorded the date and the number in the ledger. My handwriting was a jagged mess, barely recognizable as my own. I spent the morning in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I went back to the basement, this time with a hammer and a heavy iron pipe in my belt. The furnace was still roaring, pushing heat through the vents, but the basement felt just as damp as before. I started checking the crates. Most were filled with boring domestic junk, old linens, rusted kitchenware, stacks of National Geographic from the 70s. But in the far back, tucked behind a wall of rotted firewood, I found a small, locked metal footlocker. It had Miller stenciled on the side in faded white paint. The guy who didn't make it. I didn't hesitate. I used the back of the hammer to pry the lock off. It snapped with a loud crack that echoed through the stone cellar, making me jump. Inside weren't clothes or personal effects. It was filled with dozens of Polaroid photos and a small spiral-bound notebook. I picked up the photos first. My stomach turned. They were all photos of the clearing around the house, taken at various times of the day. In every single one, there was a shape. Sometimes it was a tall, blurred figure standing at the tree line. Sometimes it was just a pair of eyes reflecting the flash from a darkened window. But the last photo was the worst. It was a shot of the front porch door from the inside. In the photo, the wooden door was slightly ajar, and a paled, elongated hand with too many joints was reaching around the frame. I dropped the photos and opened the notebook. It wasn't a journal. It was a map of the mimicry. Night 14. It sounded like a dog, a hurt dog. It stayed under the porch for 3 hours. Night 22. It used my mother's voice today. It told me the recipe for the apple pie she used to make. It got the ingredients wrong. It used bone meal instead of flour. Night 45. The die isn't random. It's a countdown. It knows when you're breaking. Don't let it see you cry. The last entry was dated 2 days before Miller vanished. Rule 4 is a lie. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away. It just makes them louder. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be seen. If you don't look at them, they'll find a way to make you look. I slammed the notebook shut. My heart was racing again. Miller had gone crazy. That had to be it. Isolation does that to a man. He started seeing patterns in the static. I headed back upstairs, but as I reached the kitchen, I stopped dead. The white die was on the floor. I knew I had left it on the dining table right next to the ledger. Now it sat in the exact center of the kitchen floor, 5 feet away. 6. The dots stared up at me like unblinking eyes. "I didn't roll that," I whispered. The house didn't answer. The only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves. I looked at the table. The ledger was still open to today's date. My entry for 2 was still there. I picked up the die. It was ice cold. I put it back on the table, but my hand was shaking so much I almost dropped it. Was I sleepwalking? Was the house shifting? I didn't call the number. I had already recorded a 2. I told myself I was being logical. If I called now, I'd look like a lunatic. The rest of the day was a blur of paranoia. I found myself checking the mirrors every time I passed them, half expecting to see Miller standing behind me. I avoided the third-floor staircase entirely. The silence of the house felt like a held breath. Sunset came like a guillotine. I engaged the lights. Click, click, click. The manor blazed to life. I checked the iron bar. I checked the shutters. I sat in my chair, the shotgun heavy across my lap. Around midnight, the knocking started. Rule 4, the deaf ear. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the kitchen window. I squeezed my eyes shut. Ignore it. It's not real. It's just the wind. It's just the wood contracting. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic. 3 taps, then a pause. 3 taps, then a pause. Sam. The voice was a whisper. It wasn't my brother this time. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was a flat, toneless voice that sounded like it was being generated by a machine. "Sam, I see you. I see the die." "You lied, Sam." I gripped the shotgun so hard that checkering bit into my palms. "You recorded a 2, Sam, but the Ridge saw a 6. You're cheating. That's not how we play." Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I waited for the car crash, for the screaming, for the battering ram. Instead, I heard a sound from inside the house, a slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard from the hallway. My head snapped toward the dark corridor that led to the kitchen and the basement door. I raised the shotgun, my finger on the safety. "Who's there?" I yelled. Creak. Something was walking toward the great room. It was heavy. It didn't have the light footfalls of a human. It sounded like something dragging a heavy, wet sack of meat behind it. "I told you." The flat voice came from the darkness of the hallway. "If you don't look at us, we'll make you look." The halogens in the hallway began to flicker. One by one, they exploded. Pop, pop, pop. Glass rained down on the hardwood. The darkness was advancing, swallowing the hallway, moving toward the great room. I stood up, backing away toward the fireplace. "I have a gun. I'll blow your head off." The thing stepped into the edge of the light. It wasn't a monster. Not exactly. It was a man. He was wearing a caretaker's uniform, but it was shredded, soaked in a dark, viscous fluid that smelled like a swamp. His skin was the color of a bruised plum, and his limbs were bent at impossible angles, as if every bone in his body had been snapped and reset by a child. He didn't have a face, not anymore. Where his eyes and nose should have been, there were only jagged, raw gouge marks, exactly like the ones on the front door. It was Miller. "The die." Miller's mouth, a torn slit in his throat, gurgled. "You have to roll it again, Sam. You have to make it right." He took another step. The smell of rot was overwhelming. My American pragmatism vanished. I didn't think about the rules. I didn't think about the agency. I pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed room. The muzzle flash lit up the great room for a fraction of a second. The buckshot hit Miller square in the chest, blowing him backward into the darkness of the hall. I didn't wait. I racked the slide and fired again. And again. I emptied the magazine into the shadows until the only sound was the ringing in my ears and the thud of my own heart. I stood there, gasping, the smoke from the shotgun swirling in the yellow light. The hallway was empty. No body, no blood, only the shattered glass from the light bulbs. I turned around to grab more shells from the table, but I froze. The white die was sitting on the ledger. It hadn't moved. It was exactly where I had left it. 2. I looked at the hallway. I looked at the shotgun. I looked at the die. I hadn't fired a single shot. The shotgun was still resting on my lap. I was still sitting in the armchair. My hands were dry. The air didn't smell like gunpowder. It had been a vision, a hallucination. They were inside my head now. I looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 3 a.m. I reached out and picked up the die. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I needed to know if I was still in control. I threw the die onto the floor with a scream. It rolled across the hardwood and settled under the dining table. I crawled on my hands and knees to see it. 6. I picked it up and threw it again. 6. Again. 6. It didn't matter how I threw it. It didn't matter where it landed. The Ridge wasn't letting me play anymore. The countdown Miller mentioned in his notebook? It had reached 0. I sat on the floor in the middle of the blazing great room and started to laugh. It was a high, jagged sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. Outside, the knocking started again, but this time it wasn't on the window. It was coming from under the floorboards, directly beneath where I was sitting. Tap, "Sam," the chorus of 100 voices whispered from the wood. "We're coming up now." I grabbed the tie and squeezed it so hard it cracked. I had 178 nights left. I didn't think I'd make it to breakfast. The sound vibrated through the soles of my boots. I was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood of the great room, the shattered pieces of the white die cutting into my palm. It wasn't just the sound of knuckles on wood. It was the sound of a promise. We are coming up. I didn't scream. I think I was past the point of screaming. The human brain has a built-in circuit breaker for terror, a fail-safe that trips when reality bends too far out of shape. My breaker had tripped. Instead of panicking, a cold, unnatural calm washed over me. It was the calm of a cornered animal realizing there is no escape, only the fight. I stood up, my joints popping in the silent, glaring light of the halogens. I walked to the heavy oak dining table, grabbed the shotgun, and pumped a shell into the chamber with a loud, satisfying clack. I aimed the barrel directly at the floorboards where the tapping had originated. "Come on, then," I whispered, my voice hoarse and ragged. "Come through the floor. Let's see what 12-gauge buckshot does to a ghost." The tapping stopped. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy and mocking. They weren't going to give me a target. They were going to bleed me out, drop by drop, minute by minute. I spent the rest of the night pacing the perimeter of the great room, my eyes darting between the floor, the heavy iron bar on the front door, and the dark, yawning mouth of the hallway. I drank cold, bitter coffee straight from the thermos, the caffeine mixing with my adrenaline to create a toxic, vibrating energy in my veins. When the gray light of dawn finally began to seep through the cracks in the heavy wooden shutters, I didn't feel relief. I just felt the bone-deep exhaustion of surviving another shift. At 6:20 a.m., 20 minutes after sunrise, the massive stadium floodlights outside powered down with a heavy clunk. I walked over to the table. The shattered pieces of the die I had crushed in my hand were gone. Sitting perfectly in the center of the black leather ledger was a pristine, unbroken white die, 6 dots facing upward. I didn't question it. I didn't try to rule it again. The ridge had spoken. The countdown was over, and whatever game Elias and Miller had been playing was transitioning into a new, lethal phase. I picked up the satellite phone. The thick black plastic felt heavy and foreign in my hand. I flipped to the second page of the ledger, where a single, unlisted international number was written in Elias's frantic scrawl. I punched in the digits and hit send. The line hissed with static, a sound like dry leaves blowing across concrete. It rang once, twice. Agency. The voice on the other end wasn't human. I mean, it was spoken by a human throat, but there was zero inflection, zero empathy. It sounded like an automated corporate answering service, perfectly sterile and utterly indifferent. "This is Sam Carter," I croaked, my throat dry. "I'm the new caretaker at Blackwood Ridge. Protocol 3. I rolled a 6. There was a long pause on the line. The static swelled and receded. "Acknowledged, Mr. Carter," the voice said smoothly. "The variable has been noted. Your location is confirmed." "Listen to me," I said, my voice rising in pitch, the panic finally breaking through the ice. "You need to send someone up here, an extraction team, a helicopter. I don't care what it costs. Take it out of my pay. This house, there's something under the floorboards. There were things in the woods. Miller didn't go crazy. They killed him. They—" "Mr. Carter," the voice interrupted, completely unbothered by my screaming. "You signed a binding contract for a 6-month duration. Premature extraction violates the terms of the Blackwood Doctrine. Furthermore, weather conditions and road access prohibit any vehicular approach until the spring thaw. I am going to die up here," I yelled, slamming my fist onto the table. "You are currently entering stage 2 of the quarantine cycle. The mimicry will escalate. The spatial geography of the manor may become unreliable. Do not trust your eyes. Trust the protocol. Keep the lights on. Do not open the doors. Do not acknowledge the knocking. What is in the basement? What's in the nursery? Tell me what I'm fighting. Thank you for your report, Mr. Carter. May the lights hold. Click. The line went dead. I stared at the sat phone, a terrifying realization settling into my gut. The agency didn't exist to protect me. They existed to monitor the cage. I wasn't an employee. I was a canary in a coal mine, and they were just taking notes on how long it took for the gas to kill me. I threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the stone fireplace. Fine, I breathed, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Fine, I'll do it myself. American survivalism is a weird disease. When pushed to the absolute brink, we stop looking for the exits and start looking for nails, wood, and ammunition. I spent the next 4 hours turning Blackwood Manor into a fortress. I found a crowbar and a box of heavy framing nails in the utility closet. I went to the kitchen and tore up the heavy oak cabinets, dragging the solid wood panels into the great room. I nailed them over the interior window shutters, creating a double layer of armored wood. I dragged heavy bookcases in front of the front door, wedging them against the iron bar. I was sealing myself inside the great room. But there was still the floor. I needed to know what was in the basement. The tapping hadn't come from the deep earth. It had come from the space right between the basement ceiling and the great room floor. I grabbed the shotgun, the heavy mag light, and a crowbar. I walked down the hallway, keeping my back to the wall, and stopped at the basement door. The ambient temperature was already dropping, even though it was barely noon. The furnace I had turned on last night was apparently no longer doing its job. I pulled the door open. The smell of wet rot and ancient coal dust hit me like a physical punch. I clicked on the mag light and started down the rotting wooden stairs. Creak. Groan. Every step sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous silence. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows. I navigated through the rusted farm equipment and stacks of crates, moving directly underneath the great room. I pointed the beam of the flashlight up at the exposed wooden joists of the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat. The underside of the floorboards wasn't just old wood. It was covered in thick, black, fibrous webbing, like the nest of some monstrous subterranean spider. But that wasn't the worst part. Hanging from the joists, entangled in the black webbing, were hundreds of small, crude dolls. They were fashioned out of twigs, dirty twine, and what looked terrifyingly like human hair. They swayed slightly in the damp basement drafts. I shined the light further down the ceiling. Embedded in the wood, right below where my armchair sat in the room above, was a face. It wasn't a real face. It was carved directly into the heavy timber support beam. It was a crude, jagged carving of a screaming mouth and hollow eyes. Inside the carved mouth, someone or something had hammered dozens of rusted iron nails. Tap, tap, tap. I remembered the sound. It wasn't someone knocking on the floor. It was whatever lived down here tapping those iron nails against the wood to get my attention. Jesus Christ, I muttered, backing away. As I stepped backward, my boot hit something soft. I froze. I slowly lowered the beam of the flashlight to the concrete floor. Lying in the dust, nestled between two rotting wooden crates, was a sleeping bag. It was old, stained, and covered in a thick layer of grime. Beside the sleeping bag was a scatter of empty baked bean cans, a few spent shotgun shells, and a dead flashlight. It was a campsite. Inside the basement. I knelt down, my heart hammering against my ribs. I picked up one of the spent shells. It was relatively new. Miller hadn't been killed in the woods. When the terror got to be too much, when the things outside the house started mimicking his loved ones, he hadn't run outside. He had run down. He had locked himself in the basement to hide from the windows. But the basement wasn't safe. I shined the light deeper into the dark, toward the far foundation wall. The stone there didn't look right. It was crumbled, pushed inward. as if something massive had been steadily chipping away at the mortar for decades. There was a jagged black hole in the foundation, leading out into the deep earth beneath the ridge. A tunnel. They weren't just outside the house. They had a back door. A sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed from upstairs. I jumped out of my skin, dropping the spent shotgun shell. The sound was incredibly loud, and it came from the top of the house, the third floor. Clang, rattle, thud. It was the sound of heavy iron chains hitting the floor. Rule 5, the third floor quarantine. The temperature in the basement plummeted instantly. I could see my breath pluming in thick white clouds in the beam of the flashlight. The massive iron furnace in the corner let out a pathetic, dying hiss, and the red pilot light extinguished itself in the darkness. The cold was unnatural. It felt predatory. It sank through my clothes and bit directly into my nervous system, paralyzing my muscles. From the ceiling above me, from the third floor, echoing down the servant stairs, came the sound again. Wah, wah. The baby. The wet, gurgling, miserable cry. But this time it wasn't muffled behind a solid mahogany door. It was clear, unobstructed. The padlocks had broken. The door was open. No, 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 I breathed, panic finally seizing total control of my brain. I bolted for the stairs. I scrambled up the rotting wood, tripping, tearing the knees of my jeans, using the shotgun like a crutch. I threw myself through the basement door into the ground floor hallway and slammed it shut, driving the crowbar through the door handle to wedge it against the frame. I was gasping for air, the adrenaline making my vision blur at the edges. I looked at my watch. 3:45 p.m. Sunset was in 20 minutes. The house was going to plunge into darkness, and the thing in the nursery was out. I sprinted down the hall to the main breaker panel. I didn't wait for the 20-minute mark. I grabbed the massive lever and threw it hard. The halogens flared to life. The great room, the hallway, the kitchen, everything ignited in blinding, protective yellow light. I stood in the center of the great room, surrounded by my nailed-up barricades, the shotgun raised, pointing directly at the dark opening of the stairwell that led to the upper floors. Wah! Wah! The crying was getting closer. It was on the second-floor landing now. But underneath the crying, there was another sound, a wet, heavy, dragging sound. Thump, slide, thump, slide. Whatever was making the crying sound wasn't walking. It was pulling itself down the stairs. It sounded massive, heavy as a bear, dragging its bulk across the hardwood. The halogens in the great room began to whine. The intense electrical draw of the house was fighting against the unnatural, localized cold that was descending the stairs. I have a gun, I screamed at the empty stairwell, my voice cracking, tears of absolute terror blurring my vision. I will kill you! I swear to God, I will blow you to pieces! The crying stopped instantly. The heavy dragging sound paused. Silence hung in the house, heavier than a physical weight. The only sound was the desperate, ragged rasp of my own breathing. I kept the shotgun leveled at the top of the stairs, my finger tightening on the trigger until my knuckle turned white. Then, a voice drifted down the stairwell. It wasn't a baby. It wasn't my brother. It wasn't Elias or Miller. It was my own voice. I am going to die up here, the voice echoed perfectly, capturing the exact inflection of the scream I had directed at the agency operator an hour ago. What is in the basement? My stolen voice mocked, dripping with sadistic glee. What's in the nursery? Tell me what I'm fighting. A long, multi-toned giggle echoed down the stairs. It sounded like 3 different people laughing in unison from one throat. Thump, slide. It was on the final flight of stairs. The shadows in the stairwell began to stretch and contort, bending unnaturally away from the light. The temperature in the great room dropped below freezing. Frost raced across the hardwood floor, cracking and popping as it froze the wood. I racked the shotgun. I squared my stance. I aimed at the darkness. A pale, bloated hand reached out from the shadows of the stairwell and gripped the banister. It was massive, the skin translucent and bruised, with thick black veins pulsing underneath. The fingers ended in jagged, broken fingernails. The hand tightened on the wood groaning and splintering under the immense pressure. Thump! It pulled its bulk forward into the light. I didn't wait to see its face. I didn't wait to see what impossible geometry made up its body. My survival instinct took over completely. I aimed at center mass of the shadows and pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the 12-gauge shattered the silence. The muzzle flash illuminated a nightmare of pale flesh and too many limbs. And then, before I could rack the slide again, every single light in Blackwood Manor blew out. The darkness swallowed me whole. The shotgun was empty in the silence, and from the black void just 10 feet away, my own voice whispered, "Tag, you're it." The darkness didn't just blind me, it crushed me. When the 12-gauge flash faded, it left burned after images on my retinas, blinding purple spots dancing in a void so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I couldn't see my own hands. I couldn't see the ceiling. All I could feel was the bone-shattering cold radiating from the thing that was now sharing the great room with me. Tag, you're it. The voice was mine, but the breath that carried it smelled like a stagnant, centuries-old swamp. It was close, inches away. I didn't try to pump the shotgun. It was a long-barreled Remington, clumsy in tight quarters, and in the pitch black, the mechanical clack of the slide would just be a dinner bell. I dropped the weapon onto the hardwood floor and threw my body backward, scrambling like a crab. Something massive swept through the air where my head had been a fraction of a second before. I felt the displacement of air, the heavy whoosh of a limb that carried the weight of an anvil. It struck the stone fireplace with a sickening, wet thud, followed by the crumbling of masonry. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the frost that was rapidly coating the floorboards. The battery bank. 90 seconds. I didn't have 90 seconds. I had maybe 10 before this thing found me in the dark. I tore the heavy mag light from my belt, my thumb mashing the rubber button. The beam sliced through the blackness, a brilliant shaft of LED white, and in that light, I saw it. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon from a religious text. It was a biological impossibility, a grotesque mockery of human anatomy. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall if it stood up, but it was currently hunched over, dragging its bulk. Its skin was the color of drowned flesh, bloated and translucent, crisscrossed with thick, pulsing black veins. But it was the limbs that broke my mind. It had too many. Arms and legs of varying sizes, some muscular and hairy, some pale and feminine, all grafted haphazardly onto its central mass, pulling it forward in a spastic, horrific crawl. It didn't have a face. The front of its head was a smooth, pale dome of skin, save for a massive vertical split down the center that opened to reveal rows of jagged, broken teeth. And from that vertical maw, the voice of a crying infant poured out. The beam of the maglite hit its pale skin, and the creature let out a deafening, multi-layered shriek. The light physically hurt it. The flesh where the beam hit began to blister and smoke, smelling of burning ozone and rotting meat. It threw one of its massive, mismatched arms up to shield its faceless head, retreating toward the shadows of the stairway. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted toward the hallway. My shoulder slammed into the doorframe, sending a shockwave of pain down my collarbone, but the adrenaline masked it. I practically fell into the breaker panel, my bloody, trembling fingers ripping the steel door open. I found the heavy battery override lever. I grabbed it with both hands and threw my entire body weight downward. Clack! The house didn't erupt into the blinding, comforting yellow of the halogens. The main grid was fried. Instead, the emergency battery sequence initiated. A low, mechanical siren wailed once, and then the emergency lights flickered on. They were set deep into the ceilings, dim, blood-red bulbs designed for absolute emergencies. The entire interior of Blackwood Manor was instantly bathed in a sinister crimson glow. It looked like the inside of a slaughterhouse. I spun around, the mag light raised like a club. The red light was enough to keep the entity at bay, but just barely. I could see it at the edge of the great room, its massive, pale bulk shifting uneasily in the crimson shadows. It was dragging itself backward, retreating toward the basement door. It reached out, grabbed the handle, and with a casual, terrifying display of strength, ripped the entire solid oak door, hinges and all, out of the frame. It slithered down into the subterranean darkness, taking the freezing cold with it. I stood in the red hallway, my chest heaving, the air tearing at my lungs. The battery system was designed to run the red emergency lights for maybe 2 hours. After that, the batteries would die. The diesel generators were dead. The sun wouldn't rise for another 12 hours. Rule 1 was broken. The lights were going to fail. Rule 2 was a death sentence. Remaining locked inside a sealed tomb with a creature that could travel through the basement tunnel meant I was just waiting to be butchered in the dark. I walked slowly back into the great room. I picked up the shotgun from the floor. I loaded 3 fresh shells from my pocket, shoving them into the tubular magazine until it wouldn't take any more. I pumped the slide. I looked at the heavy black ledger on the dining table. The white die sat there, pristine, showing its 6 dots. I walked over, picked up the pen, and opened the book to today's date. My hand was surprisingly steady now. The panic had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard core of American survivalism. Under my previous entry, I wrote 3 words in capital letters: "Fuck the rules." I grabbed my keys from the table. I wasn't going to wait for the red lights to die. I was leaving Blackwood Ridge. If they wanted to kill me, they were going to have to do it outside, in the mud and the rain, where I could at least fight back. I walked to the front door. The heavy bookcases I had dragged over to barricade myself were now just obstacles to my freedom. I kicked them aside, adrenaline granting me frantic strength. I grabbed the heavy forged iron bar, lifted it out of its brackets, and threw it to the floor. The heavy metal rang like a cracked bell. I gripped the doorknob. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale, smoky air of the manor one last time. I twisted the lock, ripped the door open, and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing rain hit my face like a spray of ground glass. The darkness of the clearing was absolute. The perimeter floodlights were dead. I raised the mag light and clicked it on, sweeping the brilliant white beam across the muddy yard. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't using the woods for cover. The clearing was full of them. There were dozens of figures standing perfectly still in the freezing rain, forming a loose semicircle between the porch and where my Silverado was parked 30 yards away. In the harsh beam of the flashlight, I saw their faces. Some looked entirely human. One looked exactly like Elias, holding a phantom shotgun, his eyes wide and dead. Another looked like my brother, Dave, his clothes charred and smoking in the rain. Others were unfinished, blank mannequins of pale, wet clay, their features smoothed over, waiting to steal a face. They were completely silent. The mimicry, the voices, the crying, it was all gone. This wasn't psychological warfare anymore. The siege was over. It was feeding time. I stood on the top step of the porch, the shotgun shouldered, the mag light gripped tightly against the wooden forend. "Get out of my way," I growled, my voice barely audible over the roaring wind. The figure that looked like my brother twitched. Its jaw unhinged, dropping impossibly low, tearing the skin of its cheeks, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It let out a shrieking metallic hiss that vibrated in my teeth. They all moved at once. It wasn't a charge, it was a tidal wave of pale flesh and rotting clothes. I didn't think, I fired. Boom! The 12-gauge roared, a flash of orange fire in the freezing rain. The buckshot caught the Dave entity dead in the chest. It didn't fall back like a human. It exploded into a spray of black, oily fluid and fibrous webbing, the illusion of humanity shattering instantly. I pumped the slide, clack, clack, fired again. I blew the leg off a blank-faced mannequin thing. It collapsed into the mud, hissing, dragging itself toward me with its arms. I launched myself off the porch, my boots hitting the deep red mud. I was screaming, a wordless, primal roar of pure aggression. I ran directly into the mass of them, swinging the heavy barrel of the shotgun like a baseball bat when they got too close. Cold, wet hands grabbed at my jacket. Claws tore through my flannel shirt, raking across my ribs. The pain was sharp and searing, but it only fueled my momentum. I shoved the barrel of the shotgun into the chest of the Elias mimic and pulled the trigger. Boom! The blast cleared a path. I was 10 feet from my truck. A massive shape dropped from the sky. It had been clinging to the roof of the manor. It landed directly on the hood of my Silverado, crushing the metal inward with a deafening crunch. It was a spider-like monstrosity, its body composed of tangled, twisted human limbs. It lunged at me from the hood. I dropped the maglite, grabbed the shotgun with both hands, aimed upward, and fired my last shell directly into its center mass. The creature shrieked, a shower of that black, foul-smelling oil raining down on my face. It tumbled off the side of the truck, thrashing violently in the mud. I didn't stop to watch it die. I grabbed the driver's side door handle, ripped it open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut and hit the automatic locks, just as 3 pale, faceless entities slammed against the driver's side window. The glass spiderwebbed, but held. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine whined, sputtered, and died. No, 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 come on! I screamed, slamming my fist against the steering wheel. The entities were swarming the truck now. The bed of the Silverado dipped under the weight of several of them climbing aboard. They began hammering their fists, their heads, their claws against the glass and the metal. The noise was deafening. I twisted the key again, pumping the gas pedal. With an aggressive, beautiful roar, the V8 engine caught and fired to life. I didn't bother with the headlights. I threw the transmission into drive, slammed my foot onto the accelerator, and dumped the clutch. The heavy, all-terrain tires bit deep into the mud and spun. Mud and rocks flew in a massive rooster tail. The truck lurched forward, slamming into the massive creatures blocking the path. I felt the heavy thuds of their bodies going under the tires. The chassis bounced violently, grinding them into the dirt. I hit the tree line at 40 miles an hour, my high beams finally flickering on, illuminating the narrow, rutted logging road. I drove like a madman. I drove like the devil himself was sitting in the passenger seat. I bounced off massive tree trunks, scraping the paint off the sides of the truck, shattering the side mirrors. I didn't care. I kept the pedal pinned to the floor. I expected them to chase me. I expected something to drop from the trees onto the roof. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the heavy, red mud spinning off my tires and the absolute blackness of the Pacific Northwest forest receding behind me. I drove for 4 hours. My hands were locked around the steering wheel in a death grip, my knuckles stark white. My ribs burned where the claws had slashed me, and the smell of the black oil was permanently burned into my sinuses. But as the road began to widen, as the dirt turned to gravel, and finally, miraculously, to cracked asphalt, the crushing weight of the ridge began to lift. The sky ahead began to lighten. The deep purple of the bruised night gave way to the pale, fragile gray of dawn. I had made it. I had broken the rules, and I had survived. At 7 a.m., I found a dilapidated, neon-lit diner sitting on the edge of the interstate. It was an ugly, beautiful beacon of American civilization. 18-wheelers were parked out front. The smell of cheap diesel and frying bacon wafted through the morning mist. I parked the battered, bloodied Silverado at the far end of the lot. I sat in the cab for a long time, just listening to the steady, rhythmic idle of the engine. I was safe. There were people here. Light. Normalcy. I killed the engine, grabbed my wallet, and stumbled out of the truck. I looked like a murder suspect, covered in mud, dried black oil, and my own blood, my clothes torn to shreds. I pushed through the glass doors of the diner. A little bell chimed merrily. The place was mostly empty, save for 2 truckers in a booth and an older waitress behind the counter wiping down the laminate surface. The fluorescent lights hummed with a comforting, domestic buzz. The waitress looked up. Her eyes widened slightly at my appearance, but she had the hardened look of someone who worked the graveyard shift on an interstate. She'd seen worse. Rough night, honey? She asked, her voice thick with cigarette smoke and genuine human warmth. I slumped onto a stool at the counter, resting my head in my hands. The formica was cool against my skin. I couldn't stop shaking. You have no idea, I whispered. Just a large black coffee, please, and use the landline to call the police. I need to report an incident. Sure thing, sweetie. Coffee first. Let me get you a fresh pot. She turned her back to grab the glass carafe. I reached into my torn jacket pocket to find a $20 bill. My fingers brushed against my keys, a few loose coins, and something else. Something hard, square, and cold. My heart skipped a beat. A drop of icy dread pooled in my stomach. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket and opened my fingers. Sitting in the center of my muddy, blood-stained palm was the pristine, white, six-sided die. 6 dots stared up at me. I left this, I choked out, my vision blurring. I left this on the table. From behind the counter, the waitress didn't turn around. She was still pouring the coffee. But when she spoke, her voice wasn't the smoky, warm tone of an older woman anymore. It was the exact, perfect voice of Elias Thorne. You can't leave the game, Sam. Elias's voice rasped from the waitress's throat. The ridge isn't a place on a map. It's an infection. And you're the carrier. The diner went dead silent. The 2 truckers in the booth had stopped eating. They were sitting perfectly still. Slowly, the waitress turned around to face me. Her eyes were gone, replaced by deep, jagged gouge marks, 4 inches deep, raw and splintered like old wood. She smiled, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Roll the die, Sam. The chorus of voices whispered from everyone in the room. Let's see what you get. I looked down at the white cube in my hand. I had broken all the rules to escape the cage, only to realize I had never been in one. Blackwood Ridge was never the trap. I was.